towards the middle of March, the emperor spent some days at Rambouillet. There were some excellent hunts there, and in one of them His Majesty himself ran down and killed a stag near St. Hubert's Pond. There was also a ball and a concert. Crescentini, Madame Grassini, and Barilli, and several famous virtuosos sang, and Telma recited verses. At 4 o'clock in the morning of April 13th, the emperor, having received tidings of a new invasion of Bavaria by the Austrians, he set out for Strasbourg with the empress, whom he left in that city. On the 15th, at 11 in the morning, he crossed the Rhine at the head of his army. The empress did not long remain alone. The Queen of Westphalia, the Queen of Holland, and her sons, the Grand Duchess of Baden, and her husband soon joined her. The splendid campaign of 1809 commenced immediately. How glorious it was, everybody knows, and also that one of the least deeds by which it was distinguished was the taking of Vienna. At the taking of Ratisbon, April 23rd, the emperor received a spent ball on his right foot, which gave him a rather bad contusion. I was with the attendants when some grenadiers of the guard came up running to tell me that His Majesty was wounded. I made all haste and arrived at the moment when Monsieur Suen was dressing it. They cut and laced the emperor's boot, and he instantly remounted his horse. Several generals urged him to rest a while, but he replied, "My dear fellows, must I not see everything?" Nothing could exceed the enthusiasm of the soldiers on learning that their chief had been wounded, but that his wound was not dangerous. "The emperor exposes himself as we do," said they. "He is no coward." The journals did not mention this event. Always before giving battle, the emperor gave instructions that in case he were wounded, every possible precaution should be taken to prevent the troops from knowing it. "Who knows," said he, "what horrible confusion might be produced by such a piece of news? The destinies of a great empire hang on my life. Remember that, gentlemen. And if I am wounded, let no one know it, if that be possible. If I am killed, try to win the battle without me. It will be time enough to tell it afterwards." 15 days after the taking of Ratisbon, I was far ahead of His Majesty on the road to Vienna, alone in a carriage with an officer of the household, when we suddenly heard frightful cries from a house on the side of the road. I called a halt at once. We alighted, and on entering this house we beheld several soldiers, stragglers such as there are in all armies, who, without disturbing themselves about the alliance between France and Bavaria, were treating most horribly a Bavarian family that occupied the house. An old grandmother, a young man, 3 children, and a young woman composed this family. Our embroidered coats luckily imposed on these madmen. We threatened them with the emperor's anger and succeeded in getting them out of the house, which we shortly afterwards quitted ourselves, covered with thanks. In the evening, I told the emperor what I had done. He approved of it highly and said, "Do what I can. There are always dastards in an army, and it is they that do the harm. A brave and good soldier would blush at such things." In the beginning of these memoirs, I had occasion to mention a controller of the kitchen, Mr. Pfister, one of the most faithful servants of His Majesty, and also one of those to whom the emperor was most attached. Monsieur Pfister had followed him to Egypt. He had incurred danger upon danger for him the day of the battle of Landshut, which either preceded or very closely followed the taking of Ratisbon. This poor fellow went mad. He ran out of his tent, hid himself in a wood near the field of battle, and stripped himself completely of his clothes. At the end of a few hours, His Majesty sent for Monsieur Pfister. He was looked for, inquired after, but no one could tell what had become of him. Fearing lest he might have been made prisoner, the emperor sent an orderly to the Austrians to reclaim his kitchen control and propose an exchange. The orderly returned, saying that the Austrians had not seen Monsieur Pfister. Greatly disturbed, the emperor ordered a search to be made in the environs, and it was then that the poor sick man was discovered entirely clothed, as I have said, crouched behind a tree in a frightful condition, all his body being torn with briars. They brought him back. He seemed quite tranquil. We thought him cured. He resumed his service, but shortly after our return to Paris, he had a new attack. He was confided to the care of the learned Dr. Esquirol, who, notwithstanding all his talent, was unable to effect his cure. I often went to see him. He had no further attacks, but his brain was turned. He heard and understood very well. His responses, however, were those of a veritable lunatic. His attachment to the emperor had not deserted him. He talked of him incessantly and always believed himself on duty near him. One day he said in a mysterious way that he wished to confide to me a terrible secret, the secret of a conspiracy against His Majesty's life. At the same time, he handed me a petition for His Majesty, and with it a bundle of little scraps of paper which he had scrawled upon himself, and which he took to be documentary evidence of the plot. At another time, he remitted to me, as usual for the emperor, a handful of small pebbles, which he called diamonds of great value. "There is more than 1,000,000's worth in what I have given you there," he said to me. The emperor, to whom I gave an account of my visits, was extremely touched by the continual preoccupation of this unfortunate, all of whose thoughts and actions bore some reference to his former master. He died without recovering his reason. May 10th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, the first lines of defense of the Austrian capital were attacked and overcome by Marshal Oudinot. The Faubourgs surrendered at discretion. Then the Duc de Montebello advanced upon the Esplanade at the head of the division, but the garrison, having closed the gates, fired a terrible discharge from the top of the ramparts. Fortunately, it killed very few people. The Duc de Montebello summoned the garrison to surrender, and the Archduke Maximilian responded that he would defend Vienna to his last breath. This reply was carried to the emperor. After holding a council with his generals, His Majesty charged Colonel Lagrange to summon the Archduke again, and the unlucky colonel had scarcely entered the city when he fell beneath the blows of the enraged populace. General O'Reilly saved his life by causing him to be picked up by his soldiers, but the Archduke Maximilian, in order to insult the emperor still further, had the person who struck the first blow at the French flag of truce marched about in triumph in the midst of the National Guard. This attack, which had revolted even some of the Viennese themselves, did not alter His Majesty's intention. He meant to push moderation and deference as far as they would go, and Prince de Neuchâtel wrote by his orders to the Archduke the following letter, a copy of which chanced to fall into my hands. Prince de Neuchâtel to His Highness the Archduke Maximilian, commanding the city of Vienna. His Majesty the Emperor and King wishes to spare this large and interesting population the calamities which menace it, and he charges me to represent to your Highness that if you persist in wishing to defend the place, you will cause the destruction of one of the most beautiful cities of Europe. In every country to which war has conducted him, my sovereign has made known his anxiety to avert the disasters it entails upon unarmed populations. Your Highness must be convinced that His Majesty is sensibly affected in beholding at the brink of ruin this city, which he is proud of having saved already. Nevertheless, contrary to the established usage in fortresses, your Highness has fired cannon from the city side when this discharge might kill not an enemy of your sovereign, but the wife or child of his most zealous adherents. If your Highness remain determined to defend the place, His Majesty will be forced to begin the assault, and the ruin of this immense capital will be consummated in 36 hours by the fire of howitzers and the bombs from our batteries, as the exterior city will be destroyed by the effect of yours. His Majesty is confident that these considerations will induce your Highness to abandon a determination which will merely retard by some instance the taking of the place. In a word, if your Highness does not decide upon a step which will save the city, its population, plunged by your fault into such frightful calamities, will be changed from faithful subjects to enemies of your family. This letter did not prevent the Archduke from persisting in his project of defense. This obstinacy wearied the emperor, and he finally gave orders to establish 2 batteries. An hour later, bombs and bullets were raining into the city. The inhabitants, with true German coolness, came upon the glacis to observe the effects of the 2 fires of attack and defense. They seemed much more interested than alarmed by the spectacle. Several cannonballs had already fallen into the court of the imperial palace when a trumpeter came out of the city to announce that the Archduchess Marie-Louise had not been able to follow her father, but lay sick in the palace and exposed to all the dangers from the artillery. The emperor immediately gave orders to have the direction of the pieces changed so that the bombs and cannonballs would pass over the palace. The Archduke did not hold out long before this brisk and energetic attack. He took to flight and abandoned Vienna to the victors. The emperor made his entry into Vienna on May 12th, a month after the occupation of Munich by the Austrians. This circumstance made a vivid impression and contributed greatly to propagate the superstitious ideas entertained by many soldiers concerning their chief. "Do you see," said they? "All he needed was time to get here. That man must be a god." "A devil, you mean," said the Austrians, whose stupefaction it is impossible to describe. It reached such a point that many allowed themselves to be taken with arms into their hands without offering the least resistance, or even trying to escape, so convinced were they that the emperor and the grenadiers of the guard were not men, and that sooner or later they must fall into the power of these supernatural enemies. Chapter 3. The emperor did not remain in Vienna. He established his headquarters at the castle of Schönbrunn, an imperial residence some half a league from the city. The ground in front of the castle was arranged for the encampment of the guard. The castle of Schönbrunn, built by the Empress Maria Theresa in 1754, in an admirable position, is irregular and very defective in point of architecture, but full of majesty. To reach it, you cross a bridge thrown across the Little Vienna River. 4 sphinxes in stone ornament this bridge, which is very large and agreeable in construction. Opposite the bridge is a fine gate leading into a large court, vast enough to permit the maneuvering of 7,000 or 8,000 men. It is square, surrounded by covered galleries, adorned with 2 large fountains with marble statues. On either side of the gate is a large obelisk in red stone surmounted by eagles of gilded lead. In German, Schönbrunn signifies beautiful fountain. This name is derived from a fresh and limpid spring found in a grove of the park. It gushes from a little eminence, around which has been constructed a small pavilion, very prettily sculptured on the interior so as to imitate stalactites. Within is a recumbent naiad holding a horn through which the water issues and falls into a marble reservoir. It is a delightful little spot in summertime. One can but praise the interior of the palace. It is richly furnished in an original and distinguished style. The emperor's sleeping chamber, the only room in the building in which there was a chimney, was wainscoted in Chinese lacquer, very old but still astonishingly fresh in its painting and gilding. The study was decorated in the same manner. All the rooms, this one excepted, were heated in winter by immense stoves, which singularly detracted from the effect of the architecture. Between the study and the emperor's bedroom was a very curious machine called the flying chair, a sort of mechanical cabin which had been constructed for the Empress Maria Theresa and served to transport her from one floor to another so that she was not obliged to go up and down the stairs like everybody else. This machine was worked by the same methods employed for those of the theater, that is, by ropes, pulleys, and counterweights. The fine plantation which serves as park and garden to the palace of Schönbrunn is not as large as it should be for an imperial residence, but it would be impossible to find one more charming or better arranged. The park of Versailles is more majestic, more grandiose, but it has not the picturesqueness, the irregularity, the fantastic and unexpected effects of the park of Schönbrunn. Malmaison might more readily be compared with it. In front of the interior facade of the palace was a magnificent parterre, at the end of which was a large reservoir, adorned by a group of statues representing the triumph of Neptune. This group is very fine. The French amateurs, and everyone wishes to be considered a connoisseur, maintain that the women were Austrian rather than Greek. They missed the slenderness and suavity of antique forms. For my part, I confess these statues seem to me very remarkable. At the end of the large avenue, and bounding the horizon, rises a hill which dominates the park. It is surmounted by a very pretty building called the Gloriette. It is a circular gallery, glazed and supported by A charming colonnade with trophies in the intervals. When coming by the road from Vienna, you catch sight, on entering the Avenue of the Glory at above, as it were blended with the palace. This view produces a very good effect. What the Austrians admire in the park of Schönbrunn is a grove in which are what they call the ruins, a reservoir with a gushing fountain which supplies several small cascades, the remains of an aqueduct and a temple, fallen vases, statues without heads, legs, and arms, these members being scattered in all directions, broken columns, half embedded in earth, upright ones supporting fragments of a pediment or entablature. All this unites to form a fine disorder and resembles a veritable antique ruin when viewed from a little distance, but seen close by, it is quite another thing. The hand of the contemporary sculptor is visible. All these fragments are plainly of one sort of stone, and the weeds pushing through the crevices of the columns show for what they are, namely stone painted to imitate verdure. But if the works of art scattered in the park of Schönbrunn are not all irreproachable, those of nature abundantly make up for this. What beautiful trees! What thick hornbeams! What deep and refreshing shades! The alleys, prodigiously high and wide, were planted with trees that united overhead and were impenetrable to sunlight. The eye lost itself in the windings of their smaller alleys, where each step revealed some agreeable surprise. At the end of the longest was the menagerie, one of the largest and most diversified in Europe. It is very ingenious in construction and might serve as a model. It is shaped like a star, in the center of which there is a very elegant little kiosk placed there by the Empress Maria Theresa as a resting place. From this kiosk, the whole menagerie is visible. Each of the rays of this star forms a private garden in which range elephants, buffaloes, camels, dromedaries, deer, kangaroos, or where tigers, bears, leopards, lions, hyenas, etc. are enclosed in fine and solid cages. Swans and rare aquatic fowl swim in ponds surrounded by railings. I especially remarked in this menagerie a very extraordinary animal which His Majesty had intended to send to France, but it died the day before it was to depart. It came from Poland. It was called Carouse. It was a sort of ox, much larger than the ordinary one, with a mane like a lion's and horns rather short and somewhat curved, but enormously thick at the base. The drums beat every morning at 6 o'clock. 2 or 3 hours later, the troops ordered for the parade were assembled in the court of honor at 10 o'clock precisely. The emperor came down the front steps and placed himself in the midst of his generals. It is impossible to form an idea of these parades, which did not in the least resemble the parades of honor in Paris. In holding these reviews, the emperor descended to the least details. He examined the soldiers one by one, so to say. He looked into the eyes of everyone to see whether he were feeling pain or pleasure in his head. He questioned the officers and sometimes even the soldiers. It was usually there that His Majesty made his promotions. He would sometimes ask a colonel who was the bravest officer of his regiment. The response was always prompt, always frank. The emperor knew this well. When the colonel had spoken, His Majesty would address himself to all the officers in general. Which is the bravest one among you? Sire, it is such a one. The two replies were nearly always alike. Then the emperor would say, I make him a baron, and I reward in him not merely his personal valor, but that of the court to which he belongs. He does not owe this favor to me alone, but also to the esteem of his comrades. It was the same with respect to the soldiers. The most distinguished for courage or good conduct rose in grade, or received gratuities or even pensions. The emperor granted one of 1,200 francs, 1,200 francs, to a soldier making his first campaign who had crossed an enemy squadron, carrying his wounded general on his shoulder and defending him as he would have done his father. In these reviews, the emperor was seen to look into the soldiers' knapsacks, to examine their account books, and to take a musket from the hands of a frail young man who looked pale and suffering, and say to him in a benevolent tone, It is very heavy. He often commanded the exercise. When he did not, it was either General Dorset, General Curial, or General Mouton. Sometimes he took whims. One morning, for example, when a regiment of the Confederation was to be reviewed, His Majesty turned towards the orderly officers and, addressing the Prince de Salm, said to him, Monsieur de Salm, these men ought to know you. Come here. Order them to charge in 12 time. The young prince blushed a good deal, but did not seem disconcerted. He bowed, drew his sword as gracefully as possible, and did what the emperor desired with an ease and precision which delighted him. Another day, the pontoon men were marching with about 40 vehicles. The emperor cried, "Halt!" and pointing out an ammunition wagon to General Bertrand, told him to call up one of his officers. "What is there in that wagon?" "Sire, some bolts, sacks of nails, ropes, hatchets, saws, "How many of all that?" The officer gave the exact number. His Majesty, to verify the report, had the wagon emptied, counted the pieces, found the numbers tally, and to assure himself that nothing had been left in the wagon, he climbed into it over the wheel, making use of the spokes. There was a movement of approbation and shouts of joy in all ranks. "Bravo," said they. "That is right. That is the way not to be deceived." All these things caused the emperor to be adored by his soldiers. Chapter 4. It was in one of these reviews of which I have just spoken, and which usually attracted a crowd of sightseers from Vienna and its suburbs, that the emperor narrowly escaped assassination. It was the 13th of October. His Majesty had just alighted from his horse and was crossing the court with Prince de Neuchâtel, General Rapp beside him, when a rather good-looking young man pushed rudely through the crowd and asked, in bad French, if he might speak to the emperor. His Majesty received him kindly, but not comprehending his language very well, he asked General Rapp to find out what he wanted. The general asked him several questions, but seeming to be dissatisfied with his replies, he ordered the officer of gendarmes who was on duty to send him away. A non-commissioned officer led the young man outside of the circle formed by the staff and thrust him back into the crowd. Nothing more was thought about him until the emperor, turning around, suddenly found the pretended solicitor approaching him again with his right hand at his breast as if to take a petition from the pocket of his coat. General Rapp seized the young man by the arm, saying, "Sir, you have been sent to me already. What do you want?" He was about to retire again when the general, thinking he looked suspicious, ordered the officer of gendarmerie to arrest him. The latter signaled his men to seize the unknown. One of them, taking him by the collar, shook him rather roughly, and his coat being half unbuttoned. Another gendarme saw something that looked like a bundle of papers, fell out of it. It was a large kitchen knife with several sheets of gray paper wrapped round it by way of a sheath. Then the gendarmes led him to General Savary. This youth was a student, the son of a Protestant minister at Naumburg. He called himself Frederick Stabs, and may have been 18 or 19 years old. His face was pale and his features effeminate. He did not for an instant deny that it had been his intention to kill the emperor. On the contrary, he boasted of it and greatly regretted that circumstances had prevented the accomplishment of his design. He had left his father's house with a horse which the need of money had obliged him to sell while on the road. None of his relatives or friends had any knowledge of his project. The day after leaving home, he had written to his father that he need not be disturbed either about him or his horse, that he had long promised someone to make a journey to Vienna, and that his family would soon hear him talked of in a way that would make them proud. He had been in Vienna only 2 days, occupying himself in the first place with finding out what he could about His Majesty's habits, and knowing that he held a review every morning in the court of the castle. He had come there once to learn the localities. The next day he meant to strike his blow and was arrested. The Duc de Rovigo, after interrogating Stabs, came to the emperor, who had returned to his apartments. At first he shrugged his shoulders, but on seeing the knife which had been taken from Stabs, he said, bring this young man here. I shall be very glad to speak with him." The Duke went out and returned in a few minutes with Stabs. When the latter entered, the emperor made a gesture of pity and said to the Prince de Neuchâtel, "But really, this is a child." An interpreter was summoned, and the interrogation began. In the first place, His Majesty had the assassin asked if he had ever seen him anywhere else. "Yes, I saw you at Erfurt last year," replied Stabs. It seems that you think nothing of a crime. Why did you wish to kill me? It is not a crime to kill you. On the contrary, it is a duty for every good German. I wanted to kill you because you are the oppressor of Germany. It was not I who began this war. It was you. Whose portrait is this? The emperor was holding a picture of a woman that had been found on stabs. It is that of my best friend, the adopted daughter of my father. How? And you are an assassin? Are you not afraid of afflicting and ruining the beings who are dear to you? I wish to do my duty. Nothing ought to prevent me. But how did you mean to set about stabbing me? I would have asked you if we were soon to have peace, and if you had said no, I would have poniarded you. He is mad, said the emperor. He is decidedly mad. And how could you hope to escape if you struck me like that in the midst of my soldiers? I knew very well to do what I was exposing myself, and I am even astonished that I am living still. This assurance affected the emperor keenly. He kept silent for some moments and looked fixedly at Stabs, who remained impassible under this glance. Then the emperor continued, She whom you love will be much afflicted. Oh, she will be afflicted, doubtless, but it will be because I have not succeeded, for she hates you at least as much as I do. Supposing I pardon you, you would make a mistake, for I should try to kill you again. The emperor sent for Mr. Carvassar, saying, This young man is either sick or mad. It cannot be otherwise. I am neither one nor the other, the assassin replied quickly. Mr. Carvassar was in the apartments. He came and felt Stab's pulse. The gentleman is well, said he. I told you so, said Stabs triumphantly. Well, doctor, said His Majesty, this young man, who is in such good health, has come 100 leagues to assassinate me. In spite of the doctor's assurance and the avowals of Stabs, the emperor, moved by the coolness and assurance of this wretch, again offered to pardon him, requiring of him as a sole condition an avowal of some repentance for his crime. But Stabs affirmed again that he regretted nothing but his ill success. Then the emperor abandoned him. Led back to prison, he persisted in his avowals and was soon brought before a military commission and condemned. He was not executed until the 17th, and from the 13th, the day of his arrest, he took no nourishment, saying that he would have strength enough to go to his death. The emperor had ordered the execution to be delayed as long as possible in the hope that sooner or later he would repent, but he remained unshaken. While they were taking him to the place where he was to be shot, overhearing someone say that peace had just been signed, he cried out in a loud voice, Long live liberty! Long live Germany! These were his last words. Chapter 5. During his sojourn at Schönbrunn, gallant adventures were not lacking to the emperor. One day, when he had come to Vienna and was riding in the Prater with a very limited suite, the Prater is a superb promenade in the Leopold Faubourg. A young German, a widow of a very rich merchant, perceived him and exclaimed involuntarily to some ladies walking with her, "'Tis he!" This exclamation was heard by His Majesty, who stopped short and saluted the ladies, smiling. She who had spoken became as red as fire. The emperor recognized her by this unequivocal sign and looked at her for a long time, afterwards resuming his promenade. For sovereigns, there is neither long waiting nor great difficulties. This new conquest of His Majesty was not less rapid than the others. In order not to be separated from her illustrious lover, Madame Blanc followed him to Bavaria and afterwards came to live in Paris, where she died in 1812. Another day, His Majesty had occasion to remark a charming young person. It was one morning in the environs of Schönbrunn. Someone was commissioned to see this damsel and ask her to meet the emperor in the castle the next evening. Chance worked marvels for His Majesty on this occasion. The splendor of so illustrious a name and the renown of his victories had produced a profound impression on the young girl's mind and disposed her to listen favorably to the proposition made her. She eagerly consented to come to the castle at the appointed hour. The person of whom I have spoken went to fetch her. I received her when she came and introduced her into His Majesty's chamber. She did not speak French, but she knew Italian perfectly, and consequently it was easy for the emperor to talk with her. He learned to his amazement that this charming damsel belonged to a very honorable Viennese family, and that in coming to see him she had no thought but that of expressing to him her admiration. The emperor respected the innocence of the young girl. He sent her back home to her parents and gave orders that pains should be taken to marry her well, a thing he made easier and finer by means of a considerable dowry. At Schönbrunn, as at Paris, the emperor ordinarily dined at 6 o'clock, but as he sometimes worked until far into the night, we always took care to provide a light supper, which was locked up in a small osier hamper covered with canvas. This had 2 keys, one of which was kept by the chief of the kitchen, the other by me. The care of this hamper was a thing that concerned nobody but me, and as His Majesty was extraordinarily temperate, he seldom asked for supper. One evening, Rustam, who had been riding at full speed all day at his master's service, was in a little salon adjoining the emperor's chamber. He saw me as I came in from assisting His Majesty to bed, and looking at the hamper with wistful eyes, he said in his bad French, "Me would like very much to eat a chicken wing. Me very hungry." I refused at first, but finally, knowing that the emperor had gone to bed and seeing no likelihood of his asking for supper that evening, I let Rustam do as he chose. Very well content, he began by taking a second joint, then a wing, and I am not sure that anything would have been left in of the fowl if I had not suddenly heard the bell ringing sharply. I entered the chamber and was frightened to hear the emperor say to me, "Cool down my chicken." My embarrassment can be imagined. I had but one, and how could I procure another at such an hour? At last I decided what to do, and thinking that it was my business to carve the fowl, and that I would thus have every facility for concealing the absence of the 2 members which Rustam had eaten, I went in boldly with the chicken turned over on the dish. Rustam followed me because if there was any scolding to be endured, I was glad enough to have him share it with me. I severed the remaining wing and presented it to the emperor. The emperor refused it, saying, "Give me the chicken. I will choose for myself." This time there was no way of escape. The dismembered chicken must be seen by His Majesty. "Hold on," said he. "How long is it since chickens have only 1 leg and only 1 wing? This is fine. It seems I must eat the leavings of others. Who was it then? Ate half my supper." I looked at Rustam, who in great confusion responded, "Me was hungry, sire. Me ate the leg and the wing." "How, you rogue! It was you? Oh, how I shall scold you for it!" Without another word, the emperor ate the remaining leg and wing. The next day, at his toilet, he summoned the Grand Marshal for some communication, and during the conversation he said to him, "Guess what I ate for my supper last night? The leavings of Monsieur Rustam. Yes, that rascal took the notion to eat half my chicken." Just then Rustam came in. "Come here, you rogue," continued the emperor. "And the first time that happens again, be sure you will pay me for it." And while saying this, he pulled him by the ears and laughed heartily. Chapter 6. May 22nd. 10 days after the emperor's triumphant entry into the Austrian capital, the Battle of Essling was fought, a bloody battle which lasted from 4 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock in the evening, a battle sadly memorable for all the old soldiers of the empire because it cost the life of perhaps the bravest of them all, the Duc de Montebello, so loyal a friend to the emperor, and the only one who shared with Marshal Augereau the right to say everything frankly to his face. On the eve of the battle, the marshal entered the apartments of His Majesty, whom he found surrounded by several persons. The Duc de Blanc always affected to place himself between the emperor and the persons who were speaking to him. The Duc de Montebello, seeing him, and his favorite maneuver, took him by the lapel of his uniform and wheeling him around said, "Take that off! The emperor has no need of your wearing it here. It is singular that on the field of battle you are always so far away from us that we never see you. But here no one can say a word to the emperor without counting your face." The Duke was furious. He looked first at the marshal and then the emperor, who contented himself with saying, "Gently, Lon." That evening in the servants' hall, we talked about this apostrophe of the marshal. An officer of the army of Egypt said that it was not surprising because the Duc de Montebello would never forgive the Duc de Blanc the death of 306 men poisoned at Jaffa. All right, that didn't happen. Dr. Lanefranc, one of those who attended the unfortunate Duc de Montebello, says that when mounting his horse to go to the Isle of Lobau, the Duke had sinister presentiments. He stopped, took the hand of Monsieur Lanefranc, and said to him with a melancholy smile, "Au revoir." It will probably not be long before you come to find us. There will be need of you today, and of these gentlemen," added he, indicating several surgeons and apothecaries who happened to be with the doctor. "Monsieur le Duc," responded Monsieur Lanfranc, "this day will add yet more to your glory." "My glory," interrupted the Marshal quickly. "Stay. Shall I speak frankly to you? I don't think well of this affair for that matter. Whatever may be the result of it, this will be my last battle." The doctor was about to ask Marshal what he meant by that, but he had put his horse to a gallop and was soon out of sight. The Austrians had been already beaten. When, between 6 and 7 o'clock in the morning of the battle, an aide-de-camp came to announce to His Majesty that the sudden rise of the Danube had set afloat a great number of large trees cut down at the time Vienna was taken, and that in drifting they had broken the bridges between Essling and the Isle of Lobau, so that the parks of reserve, a part of the heavy cavalry, and the entire corps of Marshal Davout found themselves enforced inactivity on the other bank. This mishap prevented the forward movement of the Emperor was about to make, and the enemy regained courage. Then the Duc de Montebello received orders to keep the field of battle and took up position resting against the village of Essling, instead of continuing the pursuit of the Austrians, which he had already begun. The Duc de Montebello held out from 9 o'clock in the morning until evening. At 7 o'clock the battle was won, but at 6 o'clock the unfortunate Marshal, being on an eminence to observe the movements, was struck by a ball which fractured his right hip and the patella of his left knee. He thought at first that he only had a few minutes to live, and caused himself to be carried on a stretcher to the Emperor, saying that he wished to embrace him before he died. The Emperor, seeing him thus bathed in his own blood, had the stretcher put down, and throwing himself on his knees, he took the Marshal into his arms and said to him, weeping, "Lad, do you recognize me?" "Yes, sire." "You are losing your best friend." No, you will live. It is not true, Monsieur Larry. You must answer for his life." Some of the wounded, hearing His Majesty speak thus, tried to rise on their elbow and began shouting, "Long live the Emperor!" The surgeons transported the Marshal to a little village on the riverbank called Ebersdorf, near the battlefield. Here they found in the house of a brewer a room over a stable, in which the stifling heat made still more insupportable the odor of the corpses by which the house was surrounded. But there was nothing better to be had. It was necessary to put up with it. The Marshal underwent the amputation of his thigh with heroic courage, but the fever that set in afterwards was so violent that, fearing lest he might die under the knife, the surgeons deferred cutting off the other leg. This fever was partly the result of exhaustion. When he was wounded, the Marshal had eaten nothing for 24 hours. At last, Messieurs Larry, Ivan, Paulet, and Lanfranc decided on the second amputation, and when it was over, the tranquility of the wounded man gave some hope of saving him. But it was not to be. The fever increased and took a most alarming character, in spite of all that could be done by these skillful surgeons and Dr. Frank, then the most celebrated physician in Europe. The Marshal breathed his last on the 31st of May at 5 o'clock in the evening. He was barely 40 years old. During these 8 days of agony for the sufferings he experienced, might be called by that name, the Emperor went to see him very often. He always came away in despair. I always went to see the Marshal every day. By the Emperor's desire, I admired the patience with which he supported his pain, and yet he had no hope, for he felt himself dying, and all faces told him of it. What a touching and terrible sight to see around his house, his door, and within his chamber, these old grenadiers of the guard, always impassible until then, weeping and sobbing like little children. What an atrocious thing war seems in such moments as these. The day before he died, the Marshal said to me, "I see very well, my dear Constant, that I am going to die. I desire that your master may always have near him men as loyal as I have been. Tell the Emperor that I wish to see him." I was about to start when the Emperor came in. Then there was a great silence. Everybody left the room, but the door of the chamber remained ajar, and we could catch a part of the conversation. It was long and painful. The marshal recalled his services to the emperor and ended with these words, uttered in a voice that was still loud and firm. It is not to interest thee and my family that I speak to thee like this. I do not need to recommend my wife and children to thee, since I die for thee. Thy glory commands thee to protect them, and I am not afraid in uttering these last reproaches of friendship that I shall change thy dispositions towards them. Thou hast just committed a great fault, and although it will deprive thee of thy best friend, it will not correct thee. Thy ambition is insatiable. It will ruin thee. I don't think it is true. Thou sacrificest the men who serve thee best without consideration or necessity, and when they die, thou dost not regret them. Thou hast none but flatterers around thee. I do not see one friend who dares to tell thee the truth. They will betray thee. They will abandon thee. Make haste to end this war. It is the universal wish. Thou wilt never be more powerful, but thou mayest be much more loved. Pardon these verities from a dying man. He loves thee. As he ended, the marshal offered his hand to the emperor, who embraced him weeping and without a word. The day the marshal died, his body was handed over to Monsieur Larry and Monsieur Cadet de Gracicourt, physician in ordinary to the emperor, with orders to prepare it as they had done that of Colonel Morland when he was killed at the Battle of Austerlitz. For this purpose, the corpse was transferred to Schönberg and deposited in the left wing of the castle, far enough from the inhabited apartments. In a few hours, it was necessary to plunge the mutilated body into a bathtub filled with strong solution of corrosive sublimate. This extremely dangerous operation was long and difficult. Monsieur Cassé de Gracicourt deserves praise for the courage he displayed on this occasion, for in spite of all precautions, the perfumes that were burned in the chamber, this distinguished chemist was seriously indisposed. I was one of several persons who felt a mournful curiosity to behold the body of the marshal in this condition. It was frightful. The trunk, which was steeped in the solution, was swollen in a prodigious manner, while the head, on the contrary, which had remained outside the bathtub, had shrunken singularly. The muscles of the face had contracted in the most hideous manner. The wide open eyes were starting from their sockets. After the body had remained for 8 days in the corrosive sublimate, it was put in a cask made expressly for the purpose and filled with the same liquid. It was in this cask that it made the transit from Schönberg to Strasbourg. In the latter series, it was drawn from this strange coffin and entombed in the Egyptian fashion, that is to say, swathed in bandages and with the face uncovered. Monsieur Larry and Monsieur de Gracicourt confided this honorable duty to Monsieur Fortin, a young senior physician who, in 1807, by his courage and indefatigable perseverance, had saved from certain death 900 deserted invalids left without physicians or surgeons in a hospital near Danzig, nearly all of whom were attacked by an epidemic malady.